In South Africa, agriculture is thought of as a sector where employment can be created. For example, South Africa's National Development Plan promises that 500,000 new jobs will be created in agriculture. This short film asks the question, can agricultural development actually create new jobs? We will answer this question by examining agriculture quite broadly, including the inputs, services, and processing that agriculture involves. Thus, we will determine the potential for agriculture to create jobs, both on and off the farm. This question is difficult to examine in the abstract, so we will look at it in relation to a specific place, namely, the northern part of South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. The focus is on the small town of Weenen and its surrounding farming district. One of the older towns in the province, Weenen was established in the 19th century by European settlers and arranged around a system of irrigation canals. Weenen has declined in relative importance as a farming district, marginalized by other irrigated districts, and isolated by its long distance from markets that lie along the busy N3 corridor, the highway that links the continent's busiest port of Durban to the industrial heartland of the Highveld. Yet Weenen is interesting in several ways. It continues to produce labor-intensive crops such as vegetables. It has a combination of large and small farmers, unlike many other parts of South Africa, and is close to a former homeland communal area, created as settlement reserves for Africans under apartheid. The Weenen district therefore allows us to examine several of the basic dynamics surrounding agriculture and rural employment. Indeed, it represents a microcosm of the larger South African agrarian landscape. Like virtually every South African town, Weenen has an adjacent township called eSithandeni, inhabited exclusively by black Africans and marked by high levels of poverty and unemployment. Outside of the town's urban envelope, creeping settlement onto municipal commonage or marginal commercial farms sees many black South African residents with poor access to urban amenities and infrastructural services. These conditions are not specific to Weenen. They are ubiquitous in much of the South African countryside. Significantly, most rural residents are not involved in agriculture. They are neither involved in farming, nor in the sorts of processing or support services with which it is typically linked. Their disconnection from agriculture reflects South Africa's historical legacy of racial displacement and land dispossession. The net result is a countryside which is home to at least 7 million landless people, who are neither employed in agriculture nor farming for themselves. Unlike the trajectory in the developed world since the Industrial Revolution, rising agricultural development and declining rural employment is not matched by increased urban industrial employment in South Africa. However, rural areas are not only agricultural zones. Wildlife parks and game farms increasingly dot the countryside. Yet these are often less labor-intensive than agriculture, and can be enclaves, separate from the local district economy, and offering relatively limited employment opportunities. South Africa's small rural towns are often marked by few local economic multipliers. The cash that enters the local economy often does not circulate widely, and generates few employment opportunities. Even commodities produced locally, vegetables in the case of Weenen, are procured from far away, limiting the scope for local economic activity. Although Weenen lacks many large chain supermarkets, it does provide an example of the common South African pattern, where money enters the local economy, is spent at a local retailer, and is repatriated to the major urban center. This reflects the nature of South Africa's highly concentrated food retail environment, where 4 retailers dominate the food system, often supplying rural towns with food procured from distant markets and distribution centers. The typical basket of food consumed by the rural poor is sourced from the industrial economy. Yet despite this unfavorable insertion into the system, rural areas do not stand apart from the larger South African economy. The corporate retailers of South Africa's formal economy have often penetrated even the most distant rural towns, with rural dwellers shopping at chain store supermarkets. In this way, rural areas are simultaneously incorporated into the industrial economy and yet estranged from economic opportunities. In this context, amidst low levels of employment, we can ask the question, how do people survive? The answers are to be found in small remittances from urban areas, limited, often seasonal agricultural employment, and state social grants. So notable are the effects of social grants that they catalyze monthly rural markets. In a context of declining employment, pervasive unemployment, and few opportunities for local multiplier effects, we ask, can agriculture contribute to rural employment and local economic development? We look at both large and small-scale agriculture to determine this. Many agricultural commodities are perishable, and the buying power is concentrated. Farmers are therefore price takers, not price makers, and the market power is in the hands of the intermediaries and retailers.
They're making 100%, and all they've done is they've come to collect it on the farm. They've moved it off to wherever they're selling, and they're doubling their money. And so it's quite in cases like that, it's a little bit, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but at the end of the day, at least you're moving your stuff.
Farmers respond to this in various ways. Some commercial farmers sell to the informal market, often in the form of bucky traders, to secure the best prices for their produce.
I think if everything had to go through the fresh produce market, maybe we'd have a more constant price. Alright? But you're getting a lot of people that are coming straight to the farmer, and the exorbitant market fees that we have to pay, makes it easier for us to sell to the guy that comes to your yard than to send it to market. You sell cabbages, 10 rand a bag, 15% is market commission. It's a lot of money if you work it out that way. And when the guy comes to your farm and buy the stuff, you're saving that 15%. You're selling it maybe R1 or R2 cheaper than the market, but then you're saving that 15% and you've got no transport cost on top of it.
Yet, many large-scale farmers face pressure. This has led to declines in their numbers and consolidation among those that remain.
Yes, it's gone drastically, I wouldn't say it's gone drastically backwards, because when we moved into Weenen years ago, there must have been 120 individual farmers, alright, each one in his own little piece of land, and today we've only got, I think it's 17. So from 120 down to 17, it's a big fall.
The smaller oaks are selling off or moving out, and the guys are buying or getting bigger and bigger. And that's definitely the case of what's happening around here. The guys that are left are buying up all the smaller farms and getting bigger, yeah.
However, the demands of the market and greater productivity put pressure on labor costs, making many farmers disinclined to create more employment. After the 2012 farm workers' strike and the rise in the minimum wage, there was evidence of an increased inclination to mechanize.
You know, you're looking at different equipment, possibly going across to a bigger tractor that's more fuel efficient. You're doing more hectares per hour, stuff like that, you know. So, yeah, and the one thing that we really found was upgrading equipment.
Really?
Not working with the old stuff, but trying to keep it fairly new,
Yeah.
and keep your breakages. Because we found that our breakages were a huge cost.
Right.
And by upgrading, selling off our older stuff and
Okay.
upgrading with new stuff,
Yeah.
we've brought our breakages right down.
In this way, the realities of agricultural production, rising efficiencies, and competition see commercial farmers inclined to shed rather than create jobs. So, if modern industrial agriculture is in fact shedding jobs, what of the multitude of inputs and support services that agriculture relies on? After all, while agriculture contributes 2.5% of GDP, various upstream and downstream linkages see agriculture-related activities account for around 12% of the economy. Perhaps the jobs in agriculture are not on the farms themselves, but elsewhere. Researchers at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, or PLAS, traced outputs and inputs and collected geospatial data for these linkages. These maps show how inputs are sourced from enterprises that are spatially widely dispersed. Many are large multinational companies that generate few opportunities for local employment. Even the local farmers' cooperative was recently facing closure, and was resurrected only through the determined efforts of a group of local farmers. If large-scale agriculture has limited potential to create employment, and the spatially dispersed, concentrated nature of input supplies also offers few jobs, what of small farmers? Small-scale farming is potentially more labor-intensive. Unfortunately, if this environment is challenging for large farmers, it is even more difficult for new entrants and small farmers. Mr. Sakela owns a few choice hectares of land, purchased with savings from urban employment. Living on the plot during the week, he returns to his homesteads and his 2 wives regularly. Unlike the commercial farmers, he relies on the labor of his large family, and some hired help.
Inkinga nje-ke ukukhompyutha nabantu namandla. Inkinga oba nayo wena ukuba mhlambe niyalima nabo bona noma ngabe bengadayisa ngemali encane bona bayazi ukuthi indawo yabo inkulu yabona wena indawo yakho incane wena nangabe ubeke lapho naso usuyehlisa wena imali yakho sewuyalimala-ke wena.
South Africa is a context where structures of agriculture, support services, and even markets have, for a century, been tailored to large-scale, capital-intensive commercial farmers. While some small-scale farmers are successful, it's often against the odds. Moreover, when small farmers' maps of inputs and markets are traced, they have much in common with larger commercial farmers. Inputs are spatially dispersed and sourced from large corporate suppliers. Viewed in terms of their maps of inputs and markets, small-scale farmers are plugged into the same distant, concentrated supply chains. These limit the potential for low or intermediate technologies and labor-intensive agriculture. This isn't nostalgia for an earlier stage of agricultural development, or a romanticized ideal of small-scale producers. The current food system certainly gives us certain kinds of efficiencies, and cheap food. but it represents far from optimal conditions for rural employment, livelihoods, and local economic activity. We must acknowledge that South Africa's trajectory of rural development works against easy market-led prescriptions for creating rural employment. On the contrary, following its current trajectory, agriculture is likely to continue to shed jobs. So what is to be done? How can this policy conundrum be resolved? The first step in responding to the challenge of rural unemployment is to realistically acknowledge the scale of the challenges involved. Much agricultural policymaking doesn't prioritize employment, and many policy prescriptions for employment are urban-focused. Secondly, agricultural policy frequently fails to grapple with the contradictions, including how productivity gains are often at odds with expanding of employment. The concentration with the agricultural value chains, their spatially dispersed nature, and the predominance of large corporations in the supply, processing, and retail of commodities mean, for many rural communities, the impact of agricultural development will remain modest. Indeed, the current model and modes of support for agricultural development are likely to continue to shed jobs in South Africa. Finally, it is useful to remember that ongoing pressures on commercial farmers driving patterns of consolidation are not only a challenge to existing farmers. They often provide formidable barriers for small and new entrants. We must be realistic about the challenge and the contradictions. Existing value chains often limit the potential of local economic impacts. If commercial farmers feel acute commercial pressure, then emerging farmers are under even greater pressure. It is only by facing these realities head-on and tailoring policies to fit that we may hope to find effective solutions to the challenges within the rural economy.